Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a really deep dive into the incredible, sprawling history of Japan.
Yeah, we've pulled together a whole lot of sources tracing the story. I mean, right from the earliest people thousands and thousands of years ago.
Tens of thousands, yeah, right up to today.
It's quite a ride. You see these periods of just massive change, huge transformations.
But also these threads that somehow just keep going through the centuries, right? Surprising continuities.
Exactly. So our mission really is to walk through this material, pull out the key stuff, the big narratives.
Maybe those aha moments, the things that make you think, okay, that's how things connect.
Mhm.
Help us understand how Japan got to be Japan.
It's a huge time frame, so yeah, buckle up.
From Paleolithic right up to Reiwa, we're covering the whole sweep based on what's in these sources.
Let's do it.
So where do we start this journey?
Yeah.
Way, way back.
We have to. The sources point to humans arriving in the islands way back in the Paleolithic. We're talking like 39,000 years ago.
No, 38,000 years. And how did they get there?
The thinking is probably by sea, which is pretty amazing for that time period.
I'll say. But finding evidence from that long ago,
Yeah.
it's tough, isn't it?
It really is. The soil in Japan is quite acidic, so bone doesn't preserve well. Very scarce.
Ah, okay. So what do we have?
Well, we have other clues, like unique stone tools, these edge-ground axes. Some are dated older than 30,000 years.
Older than 30,000 years. Amazing.
And there's evidence suggesting they were interacting with, well, extinct megafauna, giant animals,
Like what?
like a type of elephant, Paleoloxodon. Imagine that. Early humans and ancient elephants on these islands.
That definitely paints a picture. Do we know where they lived? Any specific sites?
Yeah, archaeology gives us sites like Yamashita Cave in Okinawa that's about 32,000 years old, and Shiraho Sonedabaru Cave, maybe 20,000 years old.
Okay, so from that deep, deep past, we eventually move into a period named for pottery.
That's the one, the Jomon period, Jomon. And it's a long one, roughly 13,000 BC at up to about 1,000 BC.
Cord marked, right. Tell me about that pottery.
Yeah, the name comes from the decoration. They'd roll clay into ropes, coil them up to make the pot shape, and then fire it in just an open fire.
Simple but effective. And the cord marked part.
They pressed cords, like ropes or string, into the wet clay before firing to make patterns. What's really remarkable is how old it is.
How old?
It's considered among the oldest pottery in East Asia, maybe even the world.
So you've got hunter-gatherers, basically, but they're making some of the world's earliest pottery.
Yeah,
That's unexpected.
it really is. And the sources also point out for hunter-gatherers, they were surprisingly settled, not constantly roaming. They had complex culture, living in fixed spots for long periods.
A long, stable period. Thousands of years of these sophisticated hunter-gatherers. But then things change big time.
Yeah, the Yayoi period arrives, and it kicks off earlier than people used to think, maybe 1,000 to 800 BC, really getting established around the 3rd century BC.
And this is driven by people coming from the mainland.
Exactly. Significant migration from mainland Asia, bringing a whole toolkit of transformative technologies.
What kind of stuff are we talking about?
But the big ones, wet rice cultivation, intensive farming, that's huge.
Game changer.
Totally. Plus metallurgy, bronze and iron tech coming in from China and Korea. New weaving techniques, better woodworking, even glass making, new building styles.
Wow. That's like several revolutions hitting at once.
Yeah.
What did that mean for the Jomon people already there?
Well, the Yayo, with their better food production from rice, their population just exploded, maybe a tenfold increase.
10 times.
Yeah, so they gradually overwhelmed the Jomon population geographically. But it wasn't just replacement.
No. What else?
Genetic studies suggest there was mixing too, admixture, some fusion between the groups.
So a complex picture, migration, but also some integration.
Right. There's debate, migration versus just ideas spreading, but the genetics and language studies seem to lean towards significant migration, maybe hundreds or even thousands of people arriving each year.
And health-wise, were the Yayoi better off?
It seems so, initially. Yayu sites have these big grain storehouses, suggesting better nutrition compared to late Jomon remains, which show signs of, deteriorating health.
But it wasn't all positive.
No, this period also sees more social hierarchy creeping in, stratification, and more evidence of tribal warfare. You find fortifications, graves segregated by status.
And it's during this Yayoi period that we first hear about Japan, or Wa, in written records from outside.
Yes. The earliest written mention we know of is in a Chinese history book, the Book of Han, from 111 AD. It calls the land Wa, and says it was made up of, 100 little kingdoms.
100 kingdoms. Fragmented.
Very. And then a bit later, another Chinese text, the Book of Wei, around 240 AD, talks about a powerful kingdom within Hua called Yamatai.
Ah, ruled by Queen Himiko.
That's her, a female ruler, a queen, or maybe a shamanist figure. Really fascinating. But her kingdom, Yamatai, where was it exactly? Still debated by historians today.
Queen Himiko. Bit of a historical mystery.
Definitely. This move towards bigger political units, towards unification, really picks up steam in the next period, the Kofun, starting around 250 AD.
Kofun. Named after the burial mounds, right?
Exactly. These huge burial mounds, Kofun, are the defining feature. They signal the rise of powerful regional rulers.
How huge are we talking?
Some are absolutely massive. The Nason-Reese Kofun, for example. It's keyhole-shaped, almost 500 meters long.
Half a kilometer? For a tomb?
Yeah. Believed to be for Emperor Nintoku, they reckon it took maybe 15 years and huge numbers of laborers to build.
15 years. That really speaks to the level of social organization and the power these rulers wielded.
It does. And these kofun were often surrounded or filled with clay figures called haniwa.
Haniwa, what were they?
Sculptures of warriors, horses, houses, things like that. They give us little glimpses into the society, their beliefs, what was important to them.
So this growing power unification leads into the Yamato period.
Right. Centered on the Yamato region, modern Nara Prefecture. This is where we see a single unified state really start to take shape around the imperial line.
And this is the imperial line, the one that continues today.
That's the one. It's noted as the world's longest continuous dynasty, which is pretty incredible.
How did they expand their power? Just conquest?
Conquest was part of it, sure, but also politics. They persuaded local chieftains, the heads of these powerful clans called uji, to accept Yamato authority.
Wow.
Often by giving them positions in the new government structure, a bit of give and take. They also looked outward, seeking diplomatic recognition from China. Chinese records mention the 5 kings of Hua.
Smart. And they benefited from expertise coming from the continent.
Hugely important. The sources stress the role of skilled immigrants, craftsmen, and scholars from kingdoms in Korea, like Baekje and China. They brought crucial skills in administration, technology, writing, basically the toolkit for building a state.
There was also some internal struggle mentioned, Yamato versus Izumo.
Yeah, an earlier power struggle between these two major federations is noted in the historical traditions. Yamato eventually came out on top.
Okay, a major turning point culturally and politically arrives with the Asuka period.
Starting around 538 AD. The big event is the official introduction of Buddhism.
From Korea.
Yes, from the Korean kingdom of Baekje. But, importantly, it didn't replace the native beliefs, Shinto. They started to coexist.
A blending.
Exactly. This merging of Buddhism and Shinto is called Shinbutsu Shugu, and it shaped Japanese religious life for centuries. The capital was in the Asuka region.
And certain clans were behind this push for Buddhism.
The Soga clan were major patrons of Buddhism. They gained enormous influence, basically running the government from behind the scenes for a while.
Then we have Prince Shitoku, a really key figure.
Absolutely. Regent from 594 to 622. He was a big advocate for Buddhism, partly of Soga descent himself. He's credited with things like the 17-article constitution.
Which was like an early attempt at setting out principles for governing, based on Confucian ideas.
Right. And he tried to establish a merit-based system for officials, the cap and rank system.
And didn't he send a famous letter to China? Get cheeky.
Aha. Yeah, that's the one. Around 607. Instead of the usual subservient tone China expected, his letter opens something like, "The ruler of the land of the rising sun addresses the ruler of the land of the setting sun."
Ooh. Subtle but pointed, asserting a kind of equality.
Definitely ruffled some feathers. Importantly, the sources also mention that during his time, or possibly through Korean missionary efforts, the long-running conflicts between Japanese forces and Korean kingdoms finally ended.
And the name Nihon for Japan starts around then, too.
Yes, related to that rising sun idea. By about 670, Nihon, meaning origin of the sun, became the official name.
Okay, after Shotoku, we get the Taika reforms, another big restructuring.
Very big. Launched in 645. Led by Prince Naka no E and Fujiwara not Komatari is the founder of the Fujiwara clan, remember that name. They overthrew the Soga.
And the goal was more central power for the emperor.
Exactly. Greater centralization, strengthening the imperial court, and they looked directly to China, specifically the Tang dynasty, for their model.
What did the reforms actually do?
Key things were land reform, trying to nationalize land and redistribute it based on population, setting up household registers for taxes, a new tax system. They also sent official missions, envoys, and students to China to learn everything: writing, politics, art, religion.
So to give knowledge.
Right. Then a civil war, the Jinshin War in 672, kind of reinforced the need for a strong central administration. This all culminated in the Taihu Code around 701.
The Ritsuri state.
Correct.
Yeah.
This established a whole system of laws and government based on Chinese models. In theory, it was meant to provide the framework for governing Japan for, well, half a millennium.
And the culture of this Asuki period reflects that Buddhist influence strongly.
Very much so. Buddhist themes dominate the art. Utriji Temple is the prime example. Commissioned by Prince Shutoku, finished around 607.
That's the one known as the world's oldest wooden building.
It is, and fascinatingly, the sources note it was actually built by architects sent from the Korean kingdom of Baekje, ancient Korean expertise behind this Japanese treasure.
Another great example of those cross-cultural connections. Okay, moving on. The Nara period, 710 AD, new capital.
Yep, they built a brand new grand capital city, Heijikyu, modern Nara.
And this one really modeled on the Chinese capital.
Explicitly modeled on Chang, the Tang capital. Very planned grid layout, big symbolic statement.
This era also saw the first major Japanese books being written down.
The Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, Japan's first chronicles.
These contain the myths, right? The origin stories linking the emperors to the gods.
Exactly. Foundational texts for the imperial ideology. And literature flourished too. The Manju's poetry collection was compiled late in this period, 8th century. Still considered one of the greatest collections of Japanese poetry ever.
But Nara wasn't all high culture and grand capitals. There were serious problems too.
Oh yeah, lots of challenges. Natural disasters hit: hard fires, droughts, famines, and disease.
Smallpox.
A massive smallpox epidemic swept through from 735 to 737, killed maybe over a quarter of the entire population. Devastating.
A quarter of the people. Unimaginable. How did the ruler, Emperor Shumu, react?
He apparently saw it as a result of his own failings. His response was to double down on Buddhism, promote it even more strongly.
Like building Tudaiji Temple.
Exactly. The one with the giant bronze Buddha statue. An immense project, partly funded through efforts by the popular monk Gyuski, and the influential Chinese monk Ganjin was involved there too.
Did promoting Buddhism help stop the problems?
Well, population decline actually continued into the next era, and there were political troubles too. A monk named Dushio tried to usurp power in the 760s.
That didn't work out for him, did it?
No, he lost influence after his imperial patroness died. But all this time, that Fujiwara clan we mentioned, they were quietly consolidating their position at court.
Ah, the Fujiwara. They really come into their own in the next period, the Heian period, starting 794.
Yes, with another capital move. This time to Heian Kyus, modern Kyoto.
And Kyoto stays the capital for a long time.
Over 1,000 years, until 1868. And yes, the Fujiwara family basically dominated court politics for much of this era.
How did they manage that?
Their main strategy was marriage politics.
Yeah.
They made sure Fujiwara daughters married emperors, then their grandsons would become emperors, and the Fujiwara grandfather could rule as regent, holding the real power.
Clever. Marry into the imperial line, control things through the regency.
Exactly. They perfected it. The peak of their power was under Fujiwara no Michinaga around the year 1000. We also see this practice of cloistered rule develop.
Where retired emperors still pulled the strings.
Yeah, they'd abdicate, maybe become monks, but continue to wield significant influence from behind the scenes.
But while the court in Kyoto is busy with all this political maneuvering and high culture, what's happening out in the provinces?
That's the crucial point. The court became very inward-looking. Power struggles, artistic pursuits, they kind of neglected governing the rest of the country.
And that centralized Ritsuri system started to break down.
It really decayed, especially the land system. Powerful nobles and big Buddhist temples started acquiring vast private estates called shona, and crucially, these were often tax exempt.
Tax exempt, so the central government is losing land and revenue.
Precisely. By the 11th century, these private shona controlled more land than the government did. The court basically lost its tax base.
Which meant they couldn't afford a national army anymore.
Right. So who protected these large estates? The shona owners themselves. They started hiring or developing their own private warriors.
The samurai.
This is where the samurai warrior class really emerges as a significant force.
And certain families become particularly powerful militarily.
Yes, clans like the Taira and the Minamoto Often they were descendants of imperial princes who had moved out to the provinces. They built up large landholdings, large armies of samurai retainers.
Then the government actually ended up relying on them.
Ironically, yes, the court used these emerging warrior clans to put down rebellions or fight pirates, which of course only made them more powerful. Population did seem to stabilize later in the Heian period, though, and the court did manage one last push north, consolidating control over the Emshi people in northern Honshu. The first Seitai Shogun title, Great Barbarian Subduing General, was given then. But regional conflicts involving samurai, like the former 9 Years' War or the later 3-Year War, showed where the real power was shifting.
So this growing tension between the elegant court in Kyoto and the powerful warrior clans of the provinces, it eventually has to explode, right?
It does. It boils over, starting with a succession dispute in 1156, the Hugen Rebellion.
Where different court factions hired the Taira Minamoto to fight for them.
Exactly. The Taira, led by Chira no Kiyomori, came out on top. Kiyomori then accumulated a huge amount of power in Kyoto, essentially dominating the court.
Which breeds resentment.
Big time. Rivalry led to another clash, the Heiji Rebellion in 1160. Taira won again, crushing the Minamoto leadership for a time.
But the Minamoto come back.
Yes, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had been exiled as a boy. In 1180, he raises a rebellion, kicking off the Genpei War.
A full-scale civil war between the Taira and Minamoto clans.
5 years of brutal fighting across Japan. The Minamoto finally achieved victory in 1185 at the naval battle of Dan-no-ura.
A legendary battle, led by Yoritomo's younger brother.
Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a brilliant general, but ultimately a tragic figure due to Yoritomo's jealousy. With that victory, though, Yoritomo and his samurai followers became the undisputed rulers of Japan.
Okay, before we fully enter the age of the samurai, let's pause on Heian culture. You said the court was focused on artistic pursuits.
Oh, it was an incredibly refined, aesthetically sensitive world. A real golden age for Japanese arts and literature centered on the court aristocracy.
We mentioned the poetry collections.
Like the Kokenshushu. And diaries and essays, like Kino Surayuki's Tosa Diary, or Seishinagan's Pillow Book, amazing, witty observations of court life.
And of course, The Tale of Genji.
Considered the world's first novel by many. Written by a court lady, Murasaki Shikibu. A huge, complex, psychological masterpiece. Just incredible literary output.
And they developed their own writing system, too, moving away from just Chinese characters.
Yes, the kana syllabaries were developed during this period, simpler phonetic scripts. This happened partly because official missions to Tang China ended in the 9th century, so Japanese culture began to develop more independently, finding its own voice. Architecturally, the Byudu Temple, built 1053, is another stunning example of Hei aesthetics.
Right, so Yoritomo wins the Genpei War. He's the power now. This kicks off the Kamakura period.
1185 to 1333. Yoritomo sets up his government, his headquarters, not in Kyoto, but in Kamakura in eastern Japan. This is the Bakufu, often translated as tent government, signifying its military origins.
But he didn't completely sideline the emperor.
No, crucially, he ruled in concert with the imperial court in Kyoto. The court still existed, still held symbolic legitimacy.
So how did that work?
In 1192, the emperor formally appointed Yoritomo as Seitai Shogun, that old title, Great Barbarian Subduing General. This gave him imperial sanction, legitimacy for his military rule.
Ah, so a dual system. The shogun holds the real military and political power in Kamakura.
De facto power, yes. While the emperor and the court in Kyoto maintain their symbolic authority, handle ceremonies, some bureaucratic functions, this basic setup military rule by a shogun, legitimized by a figurehead emperor, lasts with changes all the way until 1868.
How was this first shogunate, the Kamakura one, actually structured? Was it centralized like the old system tried to be?
No, much more decentralized, feudalistic, really. Yoritomo appointed loyal vassals, his gokunin, as provincial governors, shugo, and estate stewards, jitu, across the country.
So his own men are running things locally.
Right. They had their own samurai retainers, administered justice locally, collected taxes. It was a network of personal loyalty focused on Yoritomo.
What happened when Yoritomo died in 1199? Did his family keep control?
Not directly. The actual office of shogun became weaker. His wife, Huji Masako, who was from a powerful warrior family herself, the Huju clan, she and her family took over.
The Shuj regents.
Exactly. They ruled as regents, installing puppet shoguns, often young boys or imperial princes, while the Huju held the real power for about a century.
Did the imperial court ever try to fight back against this shogunate power?
Yes, they did. In 1221, the retired Emperor Go-Toba tried to rally forces and overthrow the Huji regency. This was the Juki War.
How did that go?
Badly for the emperor. The shogunate forces crushed the rebellion easily. Go-Toba and a couple of other ex-emperors were exiled. It basically cemented the shogunate's dominance over the court.
Okay, so internally the shogunate seems strong, but then they face a massive threat from outside Japan.
The Mongols, under Kublai Khan. Two huge invasion attempts.
1274 and 1281. These are the ones associated with the divine winds, the kamikaze.
That's right. The samurai on Kyushu fought incredibly hard against the invaders, who had superior numbers and weapons like gunpowder bombs. But in both invasions, the Mongol fleet was largely destroyed by massive typhoons.
Divine intervention, they believed? Saved Japan?
That was certainly the narrative. But the sources point out a crucial consequence, even in victory.
What was that?
Defending against the Mongols cost the shogunate a fortune. They spent huge amounts on defenses, mobilizing warriors.
And they couldn't pay the samurai who fought.
Exactly. They couldn't adequately reward their vassals for their service and sacrifice. This caused widespread anger and resentment among the samurai class. Their loyalty started to fray.
And that discontent played a role in a shogunate's eventual fall.
A major role. The final push came from another emperor, Go-Daigo, in 1333.
He wanted to restore direct imperial rule.
Yes, he launched a rebellion. The shogunate sent one of their top generals, Ashikaga Takauji, to crush it.
But Takauji switched sides.
He did. He turned against the Huju regents, joined forces with Emperor Go-Daigo, and overthrew the Kamakura shogunate.
Wow. So, end of an era. But the sources also say this Kamakura period, despite the wars and invasions, saw prosperity.
Yes, particularly from about 1250 onwards. Japan entered a period of significant population growth and economic expansion.
Wow.
Agriculture became much more productive, wider use of iron tools, fertilizers, better irrigation, double cropping systems. This meant more food, supporting larger villages, fewer famines, cities grew, commerce boomed.
And Buddhism continued to evolve.
It really spread beyond the elite to the common people during this time. New schools like Pure Land Buddhism, founded by Hunen, and Nichiren Buddhism, founded by Nichiren himself, gained huge followings. And Zen Buddhism became very popular, especially among the samurai.
Okay, so Ashikaga Takauji helps Emperor Go-Daigo overthrow Kamakura. But things don't stay harmonious for long.
Not at all. This leads into the Muromachi period, starting around 1333. Emperor Go-Daigo tried to concentrate all power back in the hands of the court nobility with his Kenmu Restoration.
And Takauji wasn't happy with that.
He felt sidelined, along with many other samurai. So Takauji rebelled against the emperor he just helped restore.
Oh, wow. Chaos again?
Pretty much. Takauji captured Kyoto, forced Go-Daigo to flee south, and installed a rival emperor from a different branch of the imperial family. This rival emperor then appointed Takauji as the new shogun.
So now you have two emperors, a northern court in Kyoto backed by Ashikaga, and a southern court with Go-Daigo.
Exactly. A period of civil war between the northern and southern courts that lasted for decades.
And Takauji sets up his Ashikaga shogunate in Kyoto, in the Muromachi district.
Right. But this shogunate had real trouble controlling its own powerful subordinates from the start.
The regional lords.
Yeah, the Shugo governors that the Ashikaga appointed often became incredibly powerful in their own right. They started styling themselves as daimyo, great feudal lords, ruling their provinces almost independently and often ignoring the shogun in Kyoto.
So the Ashikaga shoguns weren't always that powerful themselves.
Often they weren't. Probably the most effective one was Takauji's grandson, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who ruled in the late 14th century. He managed to expand the shogunate's power a bit, finally negotiated an end to the north-south court split in 1392, and kept the court under control.
But that stability didn't last.
No. After Yoshimitsu, the shogunate's power declined again. It all falls apart spectacularly with the Yuan War, starting in 1467.
What was that about?
Another succession dispute over who should be the next shogun. Powerful daimyo took sides, brought their armies to Kyoto, and basically burned the capital down, fighting each other.
And the shogun lost all authority after that.
Completely. The Jinin War marks the beginning of the Sengoku Jidai, the warring states period. Japan fractured into hundreds of independent domains ruled by daimyo constantly fighting each other for land and power.
The classic image of feudal Japan at war. Famous warlords like Uesugi Kenshin, Takeda Shingen,
Exactly. This is their era, a time of constant warfare. You also hear about other groups raising armies, like warrior monks from powerful monasteries or peasant leagues. And yes, this is the period associated with ninja spies and assassins, though separating fact from legend there is tough.
And right into the middle of all this fighting and chaos, Europeans arrive.
Just like that, 1543, a Portuguese ship gets blown off course, lands on Tanegashima Island off Kyushu. 3 traders step ashore. First Europeans documented in Japan.
And they brought guns.
Muskets, yeah.
Arquebuses.
And their impact was immediate and huge. The daimyo, always looking for an edge, adopted them rapidly.
Wow, rapidly.
The sources suggest that by 1556, so just 13 years later, there might have been around 300,000 muskets in use across Japan. Changed warfare fundamentally.
Wow. What else did the Portuguese bring?
Christianity. Missionaries, most famously the Jesuit Francis Xavier, who arrived in 1549, started converting people. And it caught on surprisingly well, especially in the South. Maybe 350,000 converts at its peak.
So guns and a new religion arrive almost simultaneously. What a combination.
It kicked off direct trade and cultural exchange with the West. Initially, the constant warfare actually helped the Portuguese because rival daimyo were competing for their trade goods, especially the guns.
Led to some strange situations.
Yeah, like Portuguese ships actually bombarding a Japanese castle in 1561 to help a friendly daimyo. And the first real naval battle between European ships and Japanese forces happened in 1565, the Battle of Fukuda Bay.
And that battle led the Portuguese to seek a safer harbor.
Exactly. They needed a secure base. They found it in Nagasaki.
How did that happen?
The local daimyo, Omura Sumitada, who was the first daimyo to convert to Christianity, took the name Dom Bartolomeo. He granted land in Nagasaki harbor to the Jesuits in 1571.
Granted land to the Jesuits.
Yeah, as a haven for exiled Japanese Christians and Portuguese merchants. The port grew really fast. Then in 1580, Omura went even further and basically ceded administrative control of Nagasaki directly to the Jesuit order.
Wow, a European religious order running a Japanese city. That's wild.
It really is. And the Jesuits put a lot of effort into learning the language. One of them, João Rodrigues, compiled a major Japanese-Portuguese dictionary, published in Nagasaki in 1603, made Portuguese the first Western language with a proper dictionary for Japanese. Shows how deep the connection was for a time.
So even with all the fighting, there's this intense international contact. And the sources say the economy was still growing.
Surprisingly, yes. Prosperity continued in many areas. Agriculture kept improving, trade with China and Korea continued, commerce expanded. Japan was moving towards a money economy. Daimyo even started minting their own coins. Population hit maybe 10 million by 1450.
And culture. Did the arts survive the wars?
They flourished. Many of the art forms we think of as quintessentially Japanese really developed or were refined during this Muromachi period, despite the chaos. Ink wash painting, ikebana flower arranging, the tea ceremony, Japanese gardens, bonsai, no drama.
Often patronized by the Ashikaga shoguns themselves.
Yeah, particularly Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa later on. He was a weak political leader, but a huge patron of the arts.
Okay, so out of the chaos of the warring states, finally, figures emerge who start to put Japan back together again.
Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. This brief but crucial period of reunification, roughly 1568 to 1600, is called the Azuchi Momoyama period, named after their castles.
Nobunaga, he bursts onto the scene, right?
Yeah, a minor daimyo who won a stunning victory against a much larger force at the Battle of Okihazama in 1560. Made his name overnight.
Known for being brilliant, but also incredibly harsh.
That's his reputation. Strategic genius, utterly ruthless. He was innovative, militarily embraced muskets early, developed new tactics for them. He also encouraged Christianity partly to counter powerful Buddhist monasteries who were his enemies and to secure trade with the Europeans.
And he promoted talented people regardless of their birth.
Famously so. His top general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, started out as his sandal bearer, basically a servant. Nobunaga recognized talent. The period technically starts in 1568 when he marched into Kyoto and kicked out the last Ashikaga shogun.
But Nobunaga didn't live to see the final unification. He was betrayed.
Assassinated by one of his own generals in 1582, Akechi Mitsuhide.
And Hideyoshi steps up.
Immediately. Hideyoshi defeated Akechi Mitsuhide, avenged Nobunaga, and quickly consolidated power as his successor. He's the one who completed the military reunification of Japan.
And Hideyoshi brought in some sweeping social reforms, too.
He did. Tried to lock society down after decades of war. The famous sword hunt confiscated weapons from everyone except samurai, solidifying their status as the warrior elite. He put new restrictions on the daimyo, started persecuting Christians later in his rule, and ordered a massive national land survey.
What was the point of the land survey?
It registered cultivators directly to the land as commoners, which effectively abolished most forms of slavery and serfdom. But it also tied peasants to the land, and he passed laws trying to forbid people from changing their social class, trying to create stability through rigidity.
He had ambitions beyond Japan, too, didn't he?
Huge ambitions. He dreamt of conquering China, launched 2 massive invasions of Korea starting in 1592 as a stepping stone.
How did those go?
They were ultimately disastrous failures, huge cost in lives and resources, bogged down by Korean resistance and Chinese intervention. The invasions ended shortly after Hideyoshi himself died in 1598.
And Hideyoshi's death triggers another power struggle.
Almost instantly, a conflict broke out between those loyal to Hideyoshi's young son and heir, Hideyori, and the most powerful remaining daimyo, Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Ieyasu had been an ally of Nobunaga.
Yes, a patient, cunning strategist. It all came down to one massive battle, Sekigahara, in 1600.
And Ieyasu won.
Decisively. The Battle of Sekigahara cemented Tokugawa Ieyasu's dominance and ushered in the long era of Tokugawa rule. 268 years of relative peace.
The Edo period, 1600 to 1868, named after the new capital.
Well, the shogunate seat of power, Ieyasu established his government in Edo, which is modern Tokyo. He formally became shogun in 1603. Then, very shrewdly, he abdicated just 2 years later in favor of his son Hidetada, making it clear the shogunate was hereditary in his family.
Solidifying the dynasty. Did they face any remaining opposition?
They finished off the Toyotomi clan, Hideyoshi's heirs, at the siege of Osaka in 1615. After that, Tokugawa power was pretty much absolute. They also oversaw the Satsuma domain's invasion of the Ryukyu kingdom in 1609, making it subordinate to both Satsuma and China.
How did the Tokugawa manage to keep control for so long? It's an incredibly long period of stability.
They set up a really effective system of controls. Key were the laws for the military houses, which put strict rules on the daimyo, things like needing permission to marry or repair their castles.
And the alternate attendance system, Sunken Kotai.
That was maybe the most important tool. It required every daimyo to spend every other year living in Edo, under the shogun's watch. And when they went back to their domain, they had to leave their wife and heir behind in Edo as hostages.
Wow. Kept them on a tight leash and drained their finances traveling back and forth.
Exactly, prevented them from plotting rebellion, though daimyo still had a lot of autonomy within their own domains. The central government in Edo itself grew massive, maybe the world's biggest city by the 18th century, run by councils like the Ryuji.
And the emperor. Still around.
Still in Kyoto. The shogunate funded the court, respected its symbolic status, but gave it absolutely no political power.
Social control was also very tight, wasn't it? Harsh laws.
Very harsh. Punishments like crucifixion, beheading, even boiling alive were used for various crimes. Samurai had the option of seppuku, ritual suicide, for certain offenses.
And Christianity was completely stamped out.
Seen as deeply subversive. After a major peasant uprising led by Christians, the Shimabara Rebellion in 1638, it was ruthlessly suppressed and driven underground.
Which leads to the Sokoku policy, the closed country.
Right. To prevent foreign influence, especially Christianity, and maintain control, they implemented extreme isolationist policies. Japanese were forbidden to travel abroad or return if they left. Building large, ocean-going ships was banned.
Who was allowed in?
Almost no one. Foreigners were expelled. The only Europeans permitted were the Dutch, and they were confined to a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor called Dejima. From 1634 right up to 1854, that was the single tiny window to Europe.
So trade was just with the Dutch.
Primarily Dutch, and also regulated trade with China and Korea through specific channels. Many foreign books, especially those related to Christianity or potentially subversive ideas, were banned.
Such a unique period of deliberate isolation. Were there any other foreigners who got noticed during this time, before the Dutch monopoly?
The most famous is William Adams, an English pilot who shipwrecked in Japan in 1600. He ended up becoming an advisor to Ieyasu, was made a samurai.
The inspiration for the book and series, Shogun.
That's him, an amazing story.
What was the economy like during this long peace? Did it stagnate?
Not initially. The population actually doubled in the first century, reaching about 30 million thanks to peace and improvements in agriculture. Then it kind of leveled off.
And commerce.
The shogunate invested in infrastructure, built roads like the Tokaido, abolished tolls, standardized coinage. This really helped trade boom internally. Merchants and artisans became increasingly prosperous. Cities grew hugely, Edo especially, but most people, maybe 90%, still lived and worked in the countryside as farmers.
Okay, the sources really emphasize something else that grew significantly during Edo: literacy and numeracy.
Yeah, this is a really important point. There was a huge expansion of private schools, often run by temples or shrines called terakoya.
All over the country.
Yes, and this led to a remarkable rise in literacy rates. Estimates put it around 30% overall by the end of the period, which might have been the highest in the world at the time.
30% literacy in a pre-industrial society. That's high.
It fueled a vibrant commercial publishing industry, books, woodblock prints, and numeracy levels were also quite high, comparable to places like England or the Netherlands. This widespread basic education was a huge asset later on.
The Edo period is also famous for its popular culture, the ukiyo, or floating world.
Driven by the wealthy merchant class in the cities who had money to spend on entertainment and pleasure, this gave rise to things like ukiyo-jushi novels, popular fiction.
Yeah, the ukiyo-e woodblock prints, the famous ones.
Exactly. Artists like Hokusai, Hiroshi Utamaro, the prints became incredibly sophisticated using multiple colors. They depicted city life, landscapes, actors, courtesans.
What about performing arts?
Kabuki theater became hugely popular, known for its drama and spectacle. Bunraku puppet theater also developed, new music styles using instruments like the shamisen. And poetry, like the short haiku form, was perfected by masters like Matsuo Basho. The geisha profession also emerged during this time, highly skilled female entertainers.
Now, the Tokugawa officially promoted Neo-Confucianism. How did that shape society?
It provided the ideological basis for a formal social structure. Traditionally, this was understood as a strict four-tiered hierarchy called Shinutsuroshi.
Samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants. In that order.
That was the old interpretation, yeah. Samurai warriors at the top, though only about 5–6% of the population. Then peasants, the vast majority, maybe 80%. Then craftsmen, artisans, and merchants at the bottom because they didn't produce anything, just traded.
Okay, but here's that crucial point from our sources. Again, recent scholarship has revised this understanding.
Hugely important revision, yes. Research since around the mid-1990s has shown that this strict hierarchy, especially the ranking below the samurai, wasn't really accurate. Peasants, artisans, and merchants were seen more as distinct, equal social categories, not a rigid pecking order.
Equal categories, not a ladder. That changes the picture significantly.
It does. This old hierarchical chart has actually been removed from many Japanese textbooks now. They were separate groups, yes, with restrictions.
Marriage restrictions.
Right. Strict rules about marrying between these groups or between them and the samurai or court nobility. Though loopholes existed, like adoption, especially for poor samurai marrying into wealthy merchant families.
So the official status didn't always match the economic reality. You could have broke samurai and rich merchants.
Absolutely. And this growing economic power of the merchants, despite their theoretical low status in the old model, created underlying tensions. The whole rigid Edo system, based on inherited status, became increasingly difficult to maintain as the commercial economy grew. That merchant power would eventually find a political voice after the shogunate fell.
And the shogunate did start to weaken towards the end, late 18th, early 19th century.
Definitely showing signs of strain. Agricultural growth stopped. The government handled major famines poorly, like the Tenpu famine, leading to more peasant uprisings. Government finances were shaky.
And the samurai were feeling the pinch.
Big time. The shogunate kept cutting their stipends. Many samurai were impoverished, forced to take side jobs, deeply discontented. This samurai dissatisfaction was key to the regime's eventual collapse.
New ideas were also started to filter in, despite the isolation.
Yes. Through that tiny Dutch window at Dejima came Rangaku, Dutch learning. Japanese scholars started studying Western science, medicine, astronomy from Dutch books, people like Sugita Genpaku translating medical texts.
And there was also a movement looking inward. Kukugaku.
National learning. Scholars like Matori Norinaga and Hirata Atsuten reacted against the dominance of Chinese Neo-Confucianism. They promoted native Japanese traditions, Shinto beliefs, and particularly emphasized the divine authority of the emperor, tracing his lineage back to the mythical age of the gods. This provided an ideological alternative to the shogunate.
So you have internal decay, discontent, new ideas stirring, and then the outside world forces its way in.
Commodore Matthew C. Perry, U.S. Navy, sails into Edo Bay in 1853 with his black ships, steam-powered warships bristling with cannons.
Something Japan just couldn't match militarily.
No defense against them. Perry demanded Japan end its isolation and open up to trade. The shogunate had little choice but to agree.
And this led to the unequal treaties.
Yes. Soon after Perry, other Western powers, Britain, Russia, France, forced similar treaties on Japan. These granted foreigners rights like living in treaty ports, fixed low tariffs on imports, which hurt Japanese producers, and extraterritoriality, meaning foreigners weren't subject to Japanese laws.
How did people in Japan react to the shogunate basically giving in?
Huge anger and humiliation, especially among those discontented samurai, particularly in powerful domains like Chushu and Satsuma in the south. Many adopted that Kokugaku-inspired slogan, Sonajuji.
Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian.
Exactly. Blaming the shogunate for failing to protect Japan and looking to the emperor as a symbol of national unity. These two domains, Chushu and Satsuma, eventually formed an alliance against the shogunate. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, tried to reform and hold on to power.
But it was too late.
Pretty much. In 1868, the Satsuma-Chushu alliance convinced the young Emperor Meiji to issue an edict abolishing the shogunate. Their forces marched on Edo, the shogun surrendered after a relatively brief conflict called the Boshin War, and 268 years of Tokugawa rule were over.
The Meiji Restoration. Start of modern Japan, 1868 to 1912.
Right. The emperor was nominally restored to supreme power. He moved the court from Kyoto to Edo, renaming it Tokyo Eastern Capital in 1869.
But the emperor wasn't really running things day to day.
No. The real power lay with a small group of leaders, mostly former samurai from those victorious domains, Satsuma and Choshu. These are the Meiji oligarchs.
People like Kubo Toshimichi, Saigo Takamori, Kido Takayoshi, Ito Hirobumi, Yamagata Aritomo.
Those are the key names. And they had one overriding goal: transform Japan into a modern nation-state, strong enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Western imperial powers and revise those unequal treaties.
And the changes they pushed through were radical and incredibly fast.
Absolutely breathtaking speed. They dismantled the entire feudal structure, abolished the old Edo class system, got rid of the daimyo domains, replaced them with prefectures run by central government appointees, instituted a new national tax system, lifted the ban on Christianity, built railways, telegraph lines, started universal education.
A top-down revolution. And westernization was a huge part of it.
Deliberately embraced. They hired hundreds of foreign experts, oyatoe gaikokujin, to advise on everything from industry and banking to law and military matters. Adopted the Gregorian calendar, Western dress became fashionable, even Western hairstyles. Figures like Fukuzawa Yukichi promoted Western ideas.
Science and technology imports, too.
Massively important. Western medicine, engineering, led to major advances, new institutions, discoveries by Japanese scientists building on this imported knowledge. Even literature changed, with writers like Natsume Suzeki exploring new styles and psychological themes, influenced by Western novels, but still distinctly Japanese. Women writers like Ichiyo Higuchi also gained prominence.
What about political structures? Did democracy come quickly?
Not exactly. There were demands for popular participation, the freedom and people's rights movement, but the oligarchs controlled the process. Ito Hirobumi led the drafting of the Meiji Constitution in 1889.
What kind of constitution was it?
It created an elected parliament, the Diet, but the lower house had limited powers. Voting was restricted to a tiny percentage of wealthy men initially. There was an unelected upper house of peers. And crucially, the cabinet ministers and, importantly, the military answered directly to the emperor, not the elected Diet.
Ah, so the military had a direct line to the emperor, bypassing civilian political control. That seems significant.
It proved to be very significant later on. Alongside this, the government heavily promoted nationalism. Shinto was effectively made a state religion, the emperor was venerated as a living god, and schools drilled patriotism and loyalty into students.
This push for modernization and strength quickly turned into imperialism, didn't it?
Yes, the oligarchs believed Japan needed colonies, just like the Western powers, for resources, markets, and prestige. The military often acted quite independently, even early on, like an expedition to Taiwan in 1874. Yamagata Aritomo focused on building a modern, powerful army and navy based on Western models, including national conscription.
And this new army proved effective.
It crushed the last major samurai uprising, the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigo Takamori in 1877. Then Japan turned its attention outwards. Consolidated control over Hokkaido, formally annexed the Ryukyu Kingdom, Okinawa, then looked towards Korea and China.
leading to wars.
First, the Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95. Japan stunned the world by decisively defeating China, gained Taiwan as its first major colony. This victory boosted national pride immensely and helped them finally renegotiate those unequal treaties. They also signed a key alliance with Great Britain in 1902.
Then the conflict with Russia.
The Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, another shocking victory for Japan. An Asian nation defeating a major European power. Huge impact globally. The naval victory at Tsushima was particularly decisive.
What were the consequences?
Japan gained control over Korea, making it a protectorate in 1905 and annexing it outright in 1910. It also gained territory and influence in Manchuria. Japan was now undeniably the dominant power in East Asia.
The economy was also transforming at lightning speed, industrializing.
Rapidly. Government worked closely with private entrepreneurs. The emerging zaibatsu conglomerates like Mitsubishi, Mitsui Sumitomo adopted Western tech wholesale, shifted from exporting raw materials to manufactured goods.
This must have changed society dramatically, people moving to cities.
Huge urbanization. The share of the workforce in farming dropped from maybe 75% down to 50% by the end of Meiji. Cities swelled. The first subway in Asia opened in Tokyo in 1927. Life expectancy rose, population grew significantly from around 34 million to 52 million during Meiji.
But industrialization often brings problems. Poor working conditions.
Yes, factory conditions were often harsh, leading to labor unrest, strikes, and the rise of socialist ideas. The government clamped down hard on dissent. The high treason incident of 1910 saw socialists executed, and the Tokyo secret police was formed. But there was some early labor legislation too, setting minimum ages and maximum hours in 1911.
After the long Meiji era comes the shorter Taishu period, 1912 to 1926, sometimes seen as a period of greater democracy.
There was a trend towards that, yes, often called Taishu democracy. Political parties gained more influence relative to the old oligarchs and the military, partly due to public protests like the Taishu political crisis and the rice riots of 1918.
The voting rights expanded.
Gradually, yes, culminating in the universal manhood suffrage law in 1925. All adult men could vote. A big step.
But at the same time, more repression.
Paradoxically, yes. The same year, 1925, saw the passage of the Peace Preservation Law. This gave the government sweeping powers to crack down on anyone advocating changes to the political system or challenging private property aimed squarely at socialists and communists. Shows the underlying tension.
Japan was also involved in World War I.
Joined the Allied side against Germany. Seized German colonies in Asia and the Pacific. The war was actually an economic boom time for Japan. Afterwards, Japan signed the Treaty of Versailles, joined the League of Nations, looked like a responsible member of the international community.
But then a massive disaster hit Tokyo.
The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Absolutely devastating. Over 100,000 people killed, huge parts of Tokyo and Yokohama destroyed.
And the sources mention horrific violence in the aftermath.
Tragically, yes, the Kanto massacre. In the chaos and fear after the quake, false rumors spread that Koreans were poisoning wells or starting fires. Military, police, and vigilante mobs hunted down and murdered thousands of ethnic Koreans and some Chinese and Japanese socialists. A terrible stain.
Culturally, did literature continue to develop?
Yes, prose fiction kept growing. Literacy was up, books were cheaper. You get writers like Rinosuke Akutagawa, famous for his short stories exploring human psychology, often based on historical tales. Junichiro Tanizaki explored aesthetics, modernity versus tradition, and mystery writer Edogawa Rampo became very popular.
Okay, that brings us to the long, complex Shuswa period, 1926 to 1989, Emperor Hirohito's reign.
A huge span of time covering incredible upheaval, usually divided into the pre-1945 period rising militarism, war, and the post-1945 period defeat, occupation, and the economic miracle.
Let's look at the path to World War II. Things were getting more radicalized.
Definitely. The suppression of the left continued, while radical right-wing groups, influenced by fascism and extreme nationalism, gained more and more influence, especially within the army, particularly the Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria.
And they started acting on their own, the Manchurian incident.
1931, Kwantung Army officers staged a bombing on a Japanese-controlled railway line, a false flag operation, and used it as an excuse to invade and occupy Manchuria. Crucially, they did this without authorization from the civilian government in Tokyo.
And Tokyo couldn't stop them.
Basically, no. They established the puppet state of Manchukuo. This aggression led to international condemnation and Japan withdrawing from the League of Nations in 1933.
And assassinations continued back home.
Prime Minister Inukai was assassinated in 1932 by naval officers for opposing the military's actions. He was the last party politician to be prime minister before the war. Another attempted coup by young army officers in February 1936 failed, but paradoxically, it led to the military strengthening its grip on the government even further. They pushed an expansionist agenda seeking resources and land for settlement.
Which led directly to war with China.
The Second Sino-Japanese War, starting in 1937 with a full-scale invasion. It quickly became brutal, infamous for atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre. The war bogged down into a long, costly stalemate. Japan's stated goal was to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, essentially replacing Western colonial powers with Japanese dominance.
Now, the sources mention Emperor Hirohito's role in all this is debated.
Yes, it remains highly controversial. Was he a powerless figurehead manipulated by the military? Or did he actively approve of or even encourage the expansionist policies? Historians still argue about the extent of his personal responsibility. The sources present this controversy impartially.
The U.S. opposed Japan's invasion of China, leading to friction.
Major friction. The U.S. imposed economic sanctions, especially on vital resources like oil and scrap metal. Japan responded by aligning more closely with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, signing the Tripartite Pact in 1940.
And the final straw.
When Japan occupied southern French Indochina in 1941 to secure resources, the U.S., Britain, and the Netherlands froze all Japanese assets, cutting off their oil supply almost completely. This pushed Japan towards a decision for war.
World War II in the Pacific.
Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and the military leadership decided they had to break the embargo by force. December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, brought the U.S. into the war.
Japan had stunning early successes, didn't they?
Swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific, took the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Dutch East Indies. It looked like they were unstoppable for about 6 months.
When did the tide turn?
The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a crucial naval defeat for Japan. Then the long, grinding campaign for Guadalcanal started turning the tide on land.
The sources also explicitly mention Japanese war crimes during this period.
Yes, they state clearly that the military was responsible for atrocities, including widespread mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war and civilians, biological and chemical warfare experiments, and massacres. The military also gained a reputation for fanaticism banzai charges, fighting to the death. Kamikaze suicide attacks began in 1944.
What was life like for ordinary Japanese people as the war went on?
Increasingly grim. Severe rationing of food and fuel, frequent air raid drills and blackouts, intense government propaganda, and suppression of any dissent.
And then the U.S. bombing raids started hitting the mainland.
After the U.S. captured islands like Saipan in 1944, B-29 bombers could reach Japan's cities. Massive firebombing raids destroyed large parts of Tokyo and over 60 other cities. Civilian casualties were enormous.
The battle for Okinawa in 1945 was particularly brutal.
Horrific fighting, huge casualties on both sides, including vast numbers of Okinawan civilians caught in the middle. It suggested that an invasion of the main Japanese islands would be unbelievably bloody. The giant battleship Yamato was sunk on a suicide mission trying to reach Okinawa.
And then, August 1945, the atomic bombs.
August 6th, Hiroshima. Over 70,000 killed instantly, many more later, the first use of a nuclear weapon in warfare.
3 days later.
August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria, and the U.S. dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Around 40,000 killed there.
And that led to surrender.
Japan communicated its intention to surrender on August 14th, and on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito broadcast the surrender announcement to the Japanese people, the first time most had ever heard his voice.
The end of the war brought the Allied occupation, mainly run by the Americans.
From 1945 to 1952, a period of really profound change imposed from outside. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. He implemented sweeping reforms, many inspired by the American New Deal.
What were the main goals?
2 big ones: demilitarization and democratization. Japan's military was completely disbanded, its empire dismantled. Laws used for repression, like the Peace Preservation Law and the Toko Police, were abolished. War crime trials were held for top leaders.
And democratization.
Power was decentralized. The big Zaibatsu conglomerates were broken up, though many later reformed. Major land reform transferred land from absentee landlords to the farmers who actually worked it. Labor unions were encouraged. Political power was shifted firmly to the elected parliament, the national diet.
What about the emperor?
Hirohito was allowed to remain on the throne, but purely as a symbol. He had to publicly renounce his claim to divinity, which had been a pillar of state Shinto and militarist ideology.
And a new constitution was put in place.
Written largely by MacArthur's staff, promulgated in 1947, it guaranteed extensive civil liberties, women's suffrage, workers' rights.
And Article 9, the Peace Clause.
The most famous part. Japan formally renounces war as a sovereign right and the threat or use of force to settle international disputes, and pledges never to maintain land, sea, or air forces. Hugely significant and still debated today.
The occupation ended in 1952, but the U.S. relationship remained central.
Yes, the San Francisco Peace Treaty formally ended the war for most allies in 1951, but signed alongside it was the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This established a military alliance, allowing the U.S. to keep military bases in Japan.
So Japan regained sovereignty, but with U.S. bases remaining.
Right. The occupation officially ended in 1952, though the U.S. kept administering some islands like Okinawa until 1972, and U.S. bases remain a major presence, especially in Okinawa, to this day.
The post-war era saw Japan's amazing economic recovery, the miracle.
Under leaders like Prime Minister Shigeru Shida, who focused Japan's energy single-mindedly on economic reconstruction, relying on the U.S. security guarantee, the Yoshida Doctrine. The Conservative Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, formed in 1955 and dominated politics for decades.
What fueled the miracle? How did they rebuild so fast?
The economy was stabilized early on, helped by U.S. aid and then massive procurement orders during the Korean War. Key was the close cooperation between government ministries, especially the powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, and big business. They targeted strategic industries for growth manufacturing, heavy industry, exports.
Other factors.
Successfully adopting and improving Western technology and quality control methods, like Deming's ideas, U.S. cooperation and access to the U.S. market, high domestic savings rate providing investment capital, relatively weak labor unions after initial occupation encouragement, long working hours, a generally favorable global economic climate, and the lifetime employment system in major companies provided stability.
The results were stunning.
By 1955, the economy was back to pre-war levels. By 1968, Japan was the world's second largest capitalist economy, behind only the U.S. Growth rates were phenomenal, averaging 10% a year through the 60s. Even after the 1973 oil shock, growth stayed strong, over 4% until the early 90s.
How did this affect ordinary people?
Living standards rose dramatically. Life expectancy increased. Population grew, reaching 123 million by 1990. People had money to buy consumer goods, TVs, washing machines, cars. Japan became the world leader in car manufacturing and consumer electronics.
This boom culminated in the bubble economy of the late 80s.
Yeah, fueled by speculation, stock and land prices went absolutely crazy. The Tokyo Stock Exchange became the world's largest by market capitalization in 1987. But it was unsustainable. The Plaza Accord in 1985, which strengthened the yen against the dollar, also played a role.
Internationally, Japan rejoined the world stage.
Joined the UN in 1956. Normalized relations with the Soviet Union, though the Kuril Islands dispute remains. Normalized relations with South Korea in 1965, though historical and territorial issues like the Liancourt Rocks persist. Switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China in 1972.
The U.S. alliance was the bedrock, but it wasn't always popular at home.
No, there was significant opposition. The reestablishment of the military as the Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF, in 1954, pushed by the U.S. during the Cold War, sparked huge debate about Article 9. There were ongoing protests against U.S. bases and nuclear weapons. This peaked in 1960 with massive demonstrations, the Antompo protests, against the revision of the Security Treaty, forcing Prime Minister Kishi to resign.
How did the government try to manage discontent?
Prime Minister Ita launched an income doubling plan in the 60s, focusing on economic growth to raise living standards, which was very successful. Symbolic events like the first Shinkansen bullet train line opening in 1964 and hosting the Tokyo Olympics that same year showcased Japan's recovery and modernity.
And Japanese culture started going global.
Big time. The post-occupation era was a golden age for Japanese cinema. Kurosawa, Uzu, Mizoguchi became internationally famous. And then came the waves of pop culture exports. Kaiju like Godzilla, anime, manga, video games. They became global phenomena. Writers like Kawabata, who won the Nobel Prize, and Mishima gained readers worldwide. Cultural exchange went both ways, too. U.S. soldiers brought back intriguing martial arts, for instance.
Okay, that incredible growth period ends dramatically with the start of the Heisei period, 1989 to 2019. The bubble bursts.
Emperor Akihito takes the throne just as the bubble economy collapses spectacularly in 1989-90. Stock and land prices crash. Banks are saddled with bad debt. Japan enters a long period of economic stagnation and deflation. At a falling birth rate, and the 1990s became known as the lost decade.
And the stagnation continued well beyond the 90s.
Pretty much. Economic performance remained weak for much of the Heisei period. The stock market never regained its peak. The lifetime employment system started to break down. Unemployment rose. Job insecurity became more common.
Did this economic malaise affect politics? The LDP's long dominance.
It did. The LDP's grip weakened due to the economy and a series of corruption scandals. For the first time since 1955, non-LDP coalition governments briefly came to power in the mid-90s, and again from 2009-2012, though the LDP eventually returned.
Relations with neighbors like China and South Korea remain tricky. Issues over history.
Yes, tensions over historical memory, particularly concerning Japan's wartime actions, continued to flare up periodically. Japan has issued numerous apologies over the years.
Over 50 formal apologies since the 1950s, the sources note.
Right. But some in China and Korea viewed these as insufficient or insincere, particularly when contrasted with other events.
And the sources point to nationalist politics in Japan, sometimes making things worse.
They do, mentioning things like denials of the Nanjing Massacre or other war crimes by some figures, controversies over history textbooks, and visits by prominent politicians to Yasukuni Shrine, which controversially enshrines convicted Class A war criminals alongside other war dead as actions that exacerbate tensions with neighbors. Again, the sources report this neutrally as a factor in regional relations.
What else marked the Heisei era?
Japan's population actually peaked in 2008 and started to decline. China overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy in nominal GDP around 2011. But Japanese pop culture games, anime, manga continued its global conquest. The Tokyo Skytree was completed, becoming the world's tallest tower for a time.
And a triple disaster struck in 2011.
The Chishoku earthquake and tsunami, a magnitude 9 earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded, triggered a massive tsunami that devastated the northeast coast,
leading to the Fukushima nuclear disaster.
Yes, the tsunami damaged the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, causing meltdowns in 3 reactors and significant radiation leaks. Nearly 26,000 people were killed or remain missing from the earthquake and tsunami, a national trauma.
And that brings us right up to the current era, the Reiwa period, starting in 2019.
With Emperor Naruhito ascending the throne after his father, Akihito, became the first emperor to abdicate in 200 years.
Recent events, Olympics, international relations.
Tokyo hosted the delayed 2020 Summer Olympics in 2021, first Asian city to host twice. Japan had a record medal haul. On the world stage, Japan strongly condemned Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, imposing sanctions, earning praise from President Zelensky.
And tragically, the assassination of former PM Abe in 2022.
Shinzo Abe, shot and killed while campaigning. A huge shock, especially given Japan's extremely low rates of gun violence.
Regional security seems to be a growing focus now, tensions with China.
Very much so. After U.S. Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022, China conducted military exercises firing missiles nearby. 5 of those missiles landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone, EEZ, for the first time ever. Japan protested strongly, calling it a serious threat.
And this has led to a major shift in Japan's own defense policy.
A really significant shift. In December 2022, the government announced major changes. Japan will acquire counterstrike capabilities, meaning missiles capable of hitting bases in enemy territory. And they plan to double defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027.
Which would make Japan
likely the world's 3rd biggest military spender after the US and China. A dramatic departure from its post-war posture, clearly driven by rising concerns about China, North Korea, and Russia.
We've covered such a vast sweep. Let's try to pull some threads together on social conditions across this long history. Stratification started early.
Seems so. Back in the Yayoi period, you start seeing elites controlling wealth. By the 7th century AD, that Ritsuri system had a formal structure: aristocrats, local magnates, commoners, slaves. Later, in feudal times, the elites were the court nobles, powerful Buddhist clergy, and of course the rising samurai class. And underneath, the merchant class steadily grew in economic importance, even if their official status was sometimes low.
What about women's status? It wasn't always subordinate.
The sources suggest women held more equality socially and politically in earlier periods. There's archaeological hints of female rulers prehistory, and we know there were reigning empresses in recorded history up until the Meiji Constitution in 1889 explicitly barred female succession.
So what changed? When did things get worse for women?
The import of Chinese Confucian ideas with the Ritsuri codes in the 7th, 8th centuries started the shift towards patriarchy male heads of households, women losing formal government roles, though they still wielded influence at the Heian court. But initially, things like marriage customs and property rights were fairly neutral.
But then a sharper decline later.
Yes, these sources highlight a marked deterioration from about the 14th century. The exact reasons are debated, but women across classes lost property rights, were increasingly viewed as inferior. Hideyoshi's land survey really cemented male land ownership.
And in modern times, post-WWII.
Legally, women gained full equality under the post-war constitution, voting rights, property rights. But in practice, workplace discrimination remained a huge issue for decades. The Equal Employment Opportunity Law came in 1986, but even by the 90s, women held only about 10% of management jobs. Progress has been slow.
And let's revisit that Edo class structure one last time, the Shinokush.
Right. Hideyoshi's reforms had already largely ended slavery by tying farmers to the land as commoners. The Tokugawa formalized the categories based on Neo-Confucianism.
But the key takeaway from recent scholarship is
That peasants, artisans, and merchants weren't necessarily seen as a strict hierarchy below samurai. They were more like distinct, officially equal social categories. That old ladder model is outdated according to current understanding reflected in the sources.
despite the marriage restrictions between them.
Right. And wealth didn't neatly map onto the structure either, hence poor samurai, rich merchants. That disconnect helped make the system unstable over time, leading to the rise of commercial power after Meiji.
What replaced the Edo classes after the Restoration?
Abolishing the old system initially led to more income inequality. New economic classes emerged. Capitalists, small business owners, factory workers, landlords, tenant farmers. Post-WWII reforms, especially land reform, significantly reduced inequality, making Japan one of the most egalitarian industrialized societies for a time, with surveys showing up to 90% identifying as middle class.
Lastly, the sources mention outcast communities, Burakumin.
Yes, hereditary outcast groups developed from around the 15th, 16th centuries, often associated with trades considered unclean like leatherwork or handling the dead. They fell outside the main class structure and suffered severe discrimination, which sadly persisted long after the feudal era, continuing into the 21st century, although activism has brought legal changes and some improvement in conditions.
Wow, okay. This journey through Japan's history, it really underlines how the country we see today is built on these incredibly deep and complex layers.
Absolutely. You go from pottery, older than the pyramids, to this incredibly durable imperial line, the shock arrival of muskets changing warfare overnight, those massive Kofun tombs.
The unique isolation of the Edo period, the whirlwind speed of Meiji modernization, the post-war phoenix-like rise, is an amazing narrative full of striking moments.
It really is.
Looking back across everything we've discussed, based on these sources, you really see this constant theme, don't you? Japan engaging with the outside world, whether it's Yayoi migrants, Chinese culture, European traders, American occupiers absorbing things, adapting.
But also pushing back, preserving, or reforging its own distinct identity throughout. It's a recurring tension.
And you also see the dynamic interplay between different kinds of power.
Yeah.
The court, the warriors, the merchants, the modern state. And how events like wars or those devastating earthquakes and tsunamis keep forcing shifts and reshaping society's path.
Yeah, resilience and transformation, side by side.
So maybe the thought to leave you, the listener, with is this. How does this incredibly long and layered history, this constant process of adapting, sometimes resisting, always redefining itself in response to both internal changes and external forces, how does that deep experience continue to shape Japan's choices as it navigates the really complex global challenges of the 21st century?